Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with Winvale and Daptiv. I really appreciate your time, and I will give you a brief overview about who Winvale is and about our GSA partnership, and then we will turn it over to our guest speaker today, Dave Blumhorst, for the remainder of the time. So thanks again. My name is Melissa Hotchkiss, and I'm a segment manager at Winvale. And Winvale is a value-added reseller, and we're focused on providing IT solutions to the federal government. We have a broad portfolio of partners ranging from cybersecurity, continuous monitoring, to cloud hosting solutions and workforce management. Our goal is to provide the government with best-of-breed technologies so they can realize efficiencies and better meet their mission. We have close to 500 federal government customers and have expertise in providing PPM and project management solutions to the government. Without further ado, I'll move to our presentation deck and introduce Dave Blumhorst. Dave has been with Daptiv since 2009 and is in charge of the professional service team focused on enabling successful business outcomes for customers using Daptiv's PPM toolset. Prior to joining Daptiv, Dave ran an effective IT group, a Daptiv partner and process consulting firm that delivered implementation services to Fortune 1000 clients such as the Carlyle Group, Beam Global, and Aegon USA. Dave is a seasoned executive that has run IT professional services and finance departments. He has served as a controller and CFO for small to mid-sized companies such as Clarent and was the senior director of the IT PMO at PeopleSoft. Through his 30-plus year career, he has always found innovative ways to use technology to create business value. And without further ado, Dave, you can take it away.
Thanks, Melissa. I guess that PeopleSoft one wasn't very small or mid-size. It was kind of large. And I'll linger on that one for a moment because it's where I first ran across this particular problem of resource planning and getting the most out of the scarce resources. Now, at PeopleSoft, we had, with staff augmentation contractors, about 650 people in IT. So that presented quite a problem. And that problem was defined by having way too much work for those 650 resources. I did a lot of work to try to figure that one out. Did a pretty good job of getting it figured out, and that has led to both the theories and the practices that you're going to see in this deck today. A couple of the main challenges we look at, and we have them listed here. Key one that we hear from IT departments all the time is how do I avoid those resource bottlenecks? Lots of resource contention, got one resource pool that's constantly overwhelmed. How do we avoid those? How do we improve our visibility into capacity? We see where some IT departments that are large look at all of IT and its capacity, which isn't nearly granular enough, and then some start looking at individuals, and when you have 650 people, that's way too granular. So what's the right way to look at capacity? And then how do we improve our visibility into the utilization of those resources, not just their capacity, but how they're actually doing the work? Those are the things we're going to talk about today, and we're going to set the table a little bit with some theory, if you will. What you see here is a nice picture of the PPM, Project and Portfolio Management Lifecycle. We like to break it up this way because it illustrates how projects in particular move from idea through to results, with project execution being just one thread of it. We often focus so much on the project execution thread, we forget all the other stuff going on around it. Primarily, one of the key pieces to think about is the portfolio planning cycle before projects even become projects and go into initiation phase. You can look at that as a funnel of work coming in through the intake cycle on the portfolio side, through a cyclical process. We want to match that demand coming in with the capacity available. and do a little bit of cost-benefit analysis against it as well before we decide which projects of the ones that come in here actually make it into the initiation phase of projects. This is a portfolio process, by the way, not a project process. Once we have the portfolio planned out, whether that's an annual planning cycle, a quarterly planning cycle, an ad hoc cycle, what have you, projects launch and start executing through a typical phased approach. This is just the pin box stuff. You'll have in various organizations different views of this. But while they are executing, some other things are happening. We're rolling all that information up to see the overall portfolio and how it's performing. We're reviewing the methodologies we're employing in project management to see how they're performing, if we need to make any tweaks. On the resource management side, we're moving from the capacity planning question, which we'll talk more about in a minute, to actually scheduling people, assigning them to specific tasks, and recording their utilization as feedback to the process. On the financial side, we're moving from the higher level CBA to detailed budgeting and estimating, recording actual project expenses. In the end, when we deliver the project and close out the project, we're hoping to achieve the business case that was posited back here during intake. And if we do this well, we should be measuring the benefits received from these projects, matching them up against the business case and looking at how do we perform. Of course, today what we're going to be focusing on is this resource management track. Wanted to give you the context before we flow into that, so you see how the resource management piece flows through. One of the keys is actually understanding what resource management really is. I had always heard, prior to getting deep into the resource management theory and practice, that resource management was all about finding the right people for each project. That kind of means that as the project comes up, you start looking for people to staff it. You know, if it's a really important project, you might want to get your star people on it, that kind of thing. But it was all about finding the right people for each project. One of the problems that I found with that was that by the time projects had launched, we may have already overfilled the pipe and are having a hard time finding people at all, let alone the right people. Other things that happen during the life of the project, they get pulled away by other work. There's support escalations, there's all the tier 3 stuff. There's administrative stuff they do. They go on vacation, they get sick, they go to training. We have this myth that we can put a resource on a project 40 hours a day, 40 hours a week, and that will work. Nobody has 40 hours a week, and if they work 40 hours a week, that means on a project, that means they're probably working 50 or 60 hours a week overall, the other work they have to get done. And then finally, the problem we run into is that prioritization bit with projects, especially if we've overloaded that capacity pipe. We find a lot of contention from projects. We find VPs arguing with each other over which project is more important. When I was at Clarent, I had the VP of Professional Services arguing for their new CRM tool. I had the manufacturing folks arguing for their new MRP module in the ERP system. You know, that was a real good example of, you know, just churn that we constantly see. And we want to avoid that churn if we can. So one way to look at this is, if it's not finding the right people when the project launches, what is resource management really? Here's what I think of as the real problem. I put that little target on the person's head because that's how I felt at Clarent, that's how it felt at PeopleSoft, that's how it feels to a lot of people dealing with the overwhelming amount of work that comes into IT. And by the way, it would seem that IT seems to think that other departments seem to think that IT is some sort of free good. I'm just throwing work in there, you can all get it done, you know, go ahead and do it. So the real problem becomes, I have a lot of resources that are overloaded, how do I deal with that? There's a few questions to ask that are really the right questions to ask. First of all, do I have enough capacity to do the projects? If you think about this, start thinking about the IT department with however many resources you have, kind of like a shop floor in manufacturing. I think that way because I used to do a decent bit of manufacturing process work. And when you look at it, if you run a manufacturing floor, if what you did was line up a bunch of orders, send them to the floor, and hope the floor adjusted as those orders came in, you wouldn't get much through that line. If you're making, say, one company I worked with made firefighter oxygen bottles, which come in different sizes, different pressures, different colors, that kind of stuff. If I have one order of 10 come through with one size, another order of 100 come through with another size, we're constantly changing that line. I need to plan what's going in that line. We have the same kind of problem with IT projects that come in different shapes and sizes. If we're not doing any capacity planning before we actually throw them in there, we're probably going to be very inefficient about it. So first question is, do I have enough capacity? And the second one is, given that capacity, is it in the right areas? There's a real difference between doing a web development project or an ERP enhancement or rolling out new networks to offices in remote locations. So those are really the things we want to ask. The final one then is, if we start these projects, can we finish them? The thing that causes the most churn, the thing that causes the most inefficiency, I think, in project-driven organizations like IT is constant reprioritization and churn. If you pause a project to get another priority project in, when a resource, whether it's a programmer or DBA or what have you, picks that up a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, they have to get their head back into that project. That costs time, a lot of time. There's a lot of inefficiency when you start churning the line. So we want to first figure out how to target our capacity and how to make sure we get things through the line once we start them through the line without constantly churning it. One of the things we found, and I found this at PeopleSoft, and I found it with consulting clients, and we have found it at Daptiv since. Interestingly, if you get those capacity questions answered, the scheduling, the finding the right people for the right project becomes much easier, because now you've got your demand inside the amount of capacity pipeline that you have. Let's talk a little bit about how that happens. What we like to do is actually match the resource management lifecycle up with the project lifecycle. We're answering different questions at different parts of the cycle. This is something that's often new to some people, but it's not that uncommon in resource management theory. One way to look at it is when you're doing project intake, and at PeopleSoft, for an example, we used to get 120 project requests a quarter. We might be able to execute on 20 of those. So being able to figure out which 20 was really key. And there were some ways of organizing that demand I'll get into, but the real key was, if I've got 120 requests in and I've got capacity over here for 20, how do I know which 20 to do? I'm only answering the question here, how much can I take on? Not who's going to do it yet, not who's available at certain time frames yet, just how big is this pipe? How much do we need to squeeze this intake down to feed the pipe? We get into the planning area, initiation and planning of a project, and we start allocating resources. Now we're starting to talk either roles or people, who's going to work on the project. It gets funded, we launch it, and we start assigning those resources to individual tasks to perform, and as they perform, then they start recording their utilization. As you'll see me talk throughout this presentation, I think utilization is key. I know a lot of IT departments don't like logging their time. We're going to talk a bit about that in this presentation, but the reason I'm so key on it is that is our feedback loop. The best way I can describe it is, all this planning work is your budget. If you submitted a budget to finance and said, but why should I actually submit actual expenses, they would laugh at you. I mean, that's one of those things where, yeah, but then how do you know? The utilization is the expenses. It's the expense of hours instead of dollars, but it's the expenses nonetheless, and this is the budget. You have no way of refining the budget and the planning process if you don't know the actual hours consumed. Another way to think about that is, project manager typically says, okay, this is going to be a 1-week task. So I'm going to put 40 hours on it and give this person 1 week. Lo and behold, at the end of Friday, the task is done. What we don't know is if that person took all week to do it, maybe 50, 60 hours, and busted their butt to get it done, or it was really a pretty easy task and they spent 4 hours on Friday. So the next time that kind of project comes up, the project manager says, well, this is a 1-week task, and I know that because last time I scheduled it for a week, and lo and behold, it was done in a week. Must be a 1-week task. It's like shooting in the dark. You have no idea if you hit it or not. So capacity planning itself, the first step. This is all about supply-demand matching. Demand is all the work coming in. Now notice that's not just project work. One of the interesting insights on this comes from Gartner that released a study early last year that showed that project work accounted for around 35% of all work in an IT department. It's exactly what we had at PeopleSoft. We've measured several customers of Daptiv, several at Effective IT Group, and the lowest I've seen is 17%, the highest is around 40%. So projects do not consume most of the work. What that means is if you don't know what's going on outside of projects, then you don't know how much capacity you really have for projects. So the first step in capacity planning is making sure you're accounting for all the work in IT. On the supply side then, we have to ask, well, what resources are available for the work, right? So that could be types of resources. You know, the CIO, the executives, they're probably not going to be doing project work, so you have management in there. Project managers are, DBAs are, admins maybe not, you know, so you have a whole bunch of different types of people to account for. And you also need to account for their availability. Some of them do more project work than others, some less. You know, people on the help desk do very little. Programmers may do a lot, but they still have other work that they do. So figuring out how available each type of resource is kind of step 2 in the supply-demand matching. This third point is kind of important. When you're looking at the capacity planning, you're trying to answer the question, how much capacity do we have so we know how much of that demand we need to funnel down. We're not talking people yet. We may or may not even be talking resource types yet, resource roles. We're trying to solve for the capacity problem. Don't put too fine a point on that or you get lost in the detail. Suddenly the forest gets lost for the trees. At this stage, we're asking a forest question, not a trees question. And that's kind of important or you can get really stuck in the detail and overanalyze, if you will. So accounting for all the work, part of that you see here on this screenshot. You'll see we've posited some other work types, administrative types, PMO administration, general IT administration, ERP system change orders, network maintenance, things like that, along with projects. We highlight both the scheduled work and actual work when we're rolling things up, so we have that feedback loop. But the idea of this screen is just to see that, you know, looking at work other than projects is an important thing to do because it consumes so much of the department. It also means not just logging hours against, say, buckets like, you know, IT admin and PMO admin, but allocating hours going forward. Rather than simply taking a haircut and saying this resource type does 50% project work, so we'll make them available 20 hours a week. Better to get the feedback from the time logs and figure out is that really 50% or 60% or 40%, and then allocate that out going forward so you can adjust that as more feedback comes in. Key piece of this then is with all that demand coming in, how do we actually organize the demand? The demand comes into an IT department not in the form of just projects, and typically not in the form of technology terms, if you will. Doesn't usually come in with, you know, oh, we need to add these fields to the procurement module in the ERP system. They'll come in more on like, we're having a hard time tracking which vendors are delivering timely. We're having a hard time tracking, you know, how long it takes to turn around a PO, and that can lead to things that we need to change in the ERP system. So they come in on the left in business terms. And the business units in an organization don't necessarily speak technology, so they have needs that are stated in business terms. We have people in IT that are organized by technology as opposed to business terms, say programmers, DBAs, etc. How do you turn that corner from business needs to the technology workers that get it done? One of the first things we often do is group these into various investment portfolios. Run, grow, transform is a common one. Strategic, improve, run is one I like that we developed with a customer of ours that wasn't as thrilled with the run, grow, transform model. Turns out it comes out as SIR. The idea here is you solve the strategic projects. Improvement is anything that improves the top line, bottom line of the company. Run is all that keep the lights on stuff. We like to add administrative as a bottom layer because of recording all time, including training time, PTO time, things like that. So we understand that slice of overhead. That admin slice of overhead is typically 15 to 20% of IT's work, so it's important to understand it. That work then breaks out in different scales of work: initiatives, projects, tasks, tickets, administrative duties. The reason we break it out like this is to make sure we don't confuse the type of work, the investment target, with the scale of work. People often assume strategic must be big and run must be small. But if I'm doing some major work in a data center, just to keep it running, we've got a whole suite of servers that needs to be upgraded because the current level of the OS is either being sunsetted or is just old. That can be a large scale project, but it falls in the run category here. I've seen small things done with websites that are very strategic and could be in the task bucket, even though it's strategic work. So a common thing we have to teach is breaking the type of work being done from the scale of work being done. Then your initiatives and projects are governed by your project methodologies and life cycles, and the rest underneath that, tasks or enhancements, tickets, administrative work, tend to be governed by policy rather than by process. We have to take that demand and funnel it. Now, the funneling happens typically at the project level, with those lower levels being governed by policy, with allocations to those lower levels being relatively constant, and then that 35% slice that is projects requiring the prioritization. And this just becomes a funneling process. Typically, a brief business case, maybe your lines of business prioritize their requests before it gets overall prioritized. Scorecards, which we won't get into in this particular session, are very good ways to do an apples-to-apples comparison between project requests without getting into detailed analysis. Keeps you from that analysis by paralysis bit. And then a real common best practice is the overall prioritization decided in an IT or higher cross-functional steering committee. This is a lot better than having, say, IT make the decisions, the CIO and his or her staff making the decisions. Once the IT staff is making prioritization decisions instead of the business stakeholders, you get a lot of finger pointing. The target's back on the CIO's head. I felt that one. I was really feeling that one at Clarent when I went to an executive team meeting, laid out all the stuff that was coming into IT, and the CTO, who ran the product side of things while I ran internal IT, said, "Dave, if I had all that on my plate, we couldn't get it all done. How are you going to decide what to do?" And I said, "That's why I'm here." And that's when the VP of Professional Services started arguing with the sales VP, started arguing with the CFO about which ones were to be prioritized. And I realized I'd accomplished my mission of getting them engaged in the debate instead of looking to me to make what are essentially corporate strategic decisions. Once they were engaged, we had a not easy time, but we had to go through the debates, come up with a prioritization process. The beauty of that is once you have an agreed prioritization process and it's agreed at the top, you don't get so much back chatter once you start into projects about, no, this one's more important or that. People go up to their VPs and the VPs say, nope, this is what we agreed to, this is how we're marching, let's keep going. So that consensus building at the executive level is pretty important, or at least at a cross-functional steering committee that's empowered to make those kind of decisions. Typically, it's one thing where you want to play with all those priorities. This is a type of chart that might be brought up in a steering committee with a bubble chart that shows which projects have more bang for the buck and which less. That helps you make some decisions. You might have a burn down chart to show where the money runs out, that kind of thing. Playing with that in steering committee meetings is often a good idea, but these kinds of things, the important thing to note here is these kinds of things are informative as opposed to decisive. It's important to surface information in an organized manner that allows that steering committee to do their work and make their decisions. We are not telling the steering committee, this is what we will do. We're giving them information for them to discuss and make decisions with. Now, one of the things that often comes up when we're looking at the capacity side, the supply side, is how granular are the capacity planning levels? So small organizations, and these are typically IT departments that are 50 and under, maybe up to 100, they may do their planning actually at the individual name level. People are wearing too many hats to start trying to break them up into different roles. You know, this person's a DBA, an Oracle DBA versus a SQL DBA, or doesn't do any programming, etc. At that size, you often have people wearing multiple hats, so you actually do look at individuals when it comes to some of the capacity planning. You might aggregate that up to answer the capacity question. Mid-size organizations, that's the 100 to 200, 300 size typically. You get to your classic pool setup, a pool of DBAs, a pool of C# programmers, a pool of web developers, and you set your capacity pipes based on those pools. It allows you to see if you're overloading any particular pool, if you have availability in a pool, and you can still roll up and see an overall capacity. Large IT departments, which I've done some work with, and I first did this one at PeopleSoft, we can create virtual tracks. So now imagine taking those pools that we talked about and lining them up like a virtual production track. So at PeopleSoft, with that size organization, there were DBAs that worked with the enterprise applications group. They were specialized. There were DBAs that worked on the web area. They were specialized. The infrastructure area didn't necessarily have DBAs, but they had system admins. We had 40 project managers. So project managers were even specialized by the type of project being done. Allowed us to create vertical tracks across the organization so that we could target an enterprise application project went down this track, a web development project down this track, a network rollout down this track. We had about 18 virtual tracks. That became the definition of our capacity pipe that we aimed at. In terms of seeing the capacity, charts like this are very handy, and I first did do this one at PeopleSoft before coming to Daptiv and actually creating this in Daptiv. But the idea here is you've got a capacity line that shows you your total capacity. This could be by resource type, by production track, by overall IT. But the idea is as you load up the projects, and first you have to have those in-flight projects in there, you have to have the non-project work in there, you add the requests you're looking at, where do you go over the capacity line? And as you go over the capacity line, you realize you have to start making decisions to get back inside that capacity line. Sometimes looking at this by project and non-project work, as opposed to resource types, is very valuable. What I noticed at PeopleSoft was when I was there, we had done the J.D. Edwards acquisition, and that was a huge integration project that consumed IT. As we were completing that integration work, the project load from that integration work started going down. We had these stack bars way up over capacity, but they were coming down over time. And when we hit capacity, of course, the line stayed at capacity because people find work to do. What I noticed was that the amount of project work had gone down, the amount of enhancement and task work had gone up. Basically, people were finding things to do to stay busy and starting to attack that enhancement stack. That enabled us to have a discussion about how much bandwidth do we really want to allocate for projects, tasks, administrative, that sort of thing. When we made that decision, we realized just how much bandwidth we had going forward. We could then target the projects into that bandwidth, and we had one of these charts for each of our 18 resource tracks. So a very valuable way to look at the capacity and see it going forward through time. Once you've done the capacity planning, now you are talking about finding the right people for the right job. You've gone past capacity planning into the manufacturing world. We call it shop floor control. But in this world, we'll talk about resource allocation. So if we've done the job right and reduced the workload to match the capacity, finding those people is much easier. If you've got capacity for 10 FTEs that are DBAs and you reduce the pipeline to 10 DBAs worth of work, you'll find a DBA for each of those projects. There's still a negotiation going on. There are probably a couple star DBAs that everyone wants. And those project managers need to talk to resource managers and have those negotiations. It's important to emphasize this. Even tools that are great like Daptiv that formalize that negotiation, and there are ways you can make resource managers approve project manager requests, whether in Daptiv or whether in some other formal process you have, doesn't replace the idea of those two people talking to each other and figuring it out. Even with that, staffing conflicts can still arise. Those need to be talked about. Those staffing conflicts arise for a couple of reasons, of course. One is things change. So maybe we estimated the project wrong and it's requiring more resources than we thought. Maybe another one finished early and has more resources and has released some resources that are now available. Maybe business needs have changed and we really have had to reprioritize projects. So things happen over time, even when projects are in flight, that cause these kind of conflicts to arise. One thing we want to do is see where those conflicts are. Here's a quick heat map that shows that. You can see in the yellow and red, Ernie Els here is really overloaded. It turns yellow at 45 hours, I think, and red at 50. That's also how we had it set at PeopleSoft, I think. We used this heat map style, by the way, at PeopleSoft to great effect. If you can imagine, we were going through the battle about being acquired by Oracle. We wanted to get as profitable as we could. And the word came down that we had to make some cutbacks to bring the costs down, to bring the profits up, to make the stock more expensive, to make it harder to buy us. We produced this kind of a heat map across our departments. And like many IT departments, we were overloaded in certain areas. The scariest one was Global Field Services, where we were averaging, I think it was like 70 to 80 hours a week. That's averaging for the department that deploys everything out to the field. That's scary. But the point was, the president of PeopleSoft looked at that and said, we can't cut it back as much as we thought. Instead of cutting back 10%, you're cutting back 5%, and you only have to target these areas. This heat map saved a lot of jobs. It also is really good for pointing out where your bottlenecks are. That tells you where your staffing issues are that you need to address. So, very useful report. One of the things then becomes, how do you deal with the resource contention that does occur? A lot of companies do this a lot of different ways. The best we've seen is the Resource Management Committee. And I'll tell you a story on that one too. First of all, what a Resource Management Committee is a bunch of people that gather usually weekly to look at resource contention issues as they arise and resolve them. Usually made up of resource managers, project managers. PMO plays a facilitative role, but the idea is let's look at what's changed, let's look at where the conflicts are, let's figure this out on Monday morning and reprioritize, reshuffle, what have you, to make sure things keep going smoothly. It's a much more proactive way of going about it than waiting for the conflicts to just surface and cause resource managers to start shuffling people around without project managers knowing it and that kind of thing. There was a company I worked with as a consultant about a decade ago, I guess now, a little less than that. They were a media shop. They did a lot of media advertising, one of the largest actually in the world. And they had a problem of resource churn because their projects typically lasted 2 weeks, I want to say, which meant it rolled through planning, storyboarding, web development, CD production, things like that, very, very quickly. That churn was costing them a lot of inefficiencies. One, they couldn't see their portfolio of work. Second, they weren't always sure who was working on what day. Now, and we simply put in place, first, a way to log and roll up all that project work so they could see it all. They could see which things were in flight and where they were. A way to see which people were on each of these projects, each of these media projects, and what their status was on them. And then every Monday morning they gathered as a team, looked at what do we have on our plate today? What's important? Is it the American Express project? Is it the B of A project? You know, is it the HP project? Which things are we looking at today? They would then prioritize that work, set a plan for the week, all agree, and then start going down that path. The results they reported were I believe, 300% increase in productivity, and something like 1,000% increase in their profitability on those jobs. It was staggering. But it all came from just a little bit of let's be proactive here and start handling this in an organized fashion instead of a chaotic everybody talk to everybody else and fight it out until we get someone where we want them. The other thing that happens, by the way, if you're not proactive, imagine having that resource pipe overloaded. You've got 3 programmers working on 3 projects, 4 projects make it, and none of them have the time to do all of them, and they each have to decide, which one am I working on today? So Bob goes for project A, Mary goes for project B, Steve says I'm going to work on project C. Well, they're all now working on different projects, and none of the projects are getting done, and they're all spinning because they've all chosen differently. The problem is if your resources have more work than they can handle, they're each going to make prioritization decisions, and they may or may not be the ones that you need as a corporation or that management would make. If you get proactive and management make those prioritization decisions for them, say by saying we're all working on project A, then Bob, Mary, and Steve all work on project A and you get that one done, then you move on to project B. Much, much more efficient. So having that kind of proactive process is very important as projects are executing to make sure they actually finish up, to make sure that you don't have resources making their own prioritization decisions in isolation, which just causes way too much churn. So one of those key best practices that can have a ton of impact. While we're doing all that planning and decision making and all that kind of stuff, we actually need to record the utilization. I touched on this before. That log time is very essential to providing the feedback to planning. One of the nicest things I had at PeopleSoft when I got there was they already had 2 years worth of time data. Just a treasure trove of stuff to analyze. Was it in the right buckets? Not necessarily. Was it granular enough? Not necessarily. It was all at the project level. But it was a treasure trove of data. We used that to analyze how much project time, how much task time, that kind of stuff. We used that to figure out which groups were overloaded, where the resource bottlenecks were. It fed our planning cycle, which helped a ton. One of the interesting conversations was a CIO staff meeting when we did our first cycle of making prioritization decisions based on the capacity we had, and that capacity was informed by that 2 years of time analysis we had done. David Thompson, the CIO, looked at me and said, well, Dave, how accurate is this data? It's the first time we're using it. I said, well, Dave, it's not very accurate compared to what you had last time you did this. And he kind of chuckled and went, oh, good point. We had nothing. We'll use it. The point there is not just to be humorous, but to realize that often when you start down this path, the data you have isn't the best. However, it gets refined over time. We see this in some of our customers that do resource management, whether it's Aegon that was mentioned before, or others. They start down the cycle, and it may not be as accurate as they'd like at first, but as that feedback comes in, and as the data gets refined, the planning gets refined, and it all starts smoothing out. So the point isn't to make sure that the utilization analysis and the capacity planning is 100% accurate from day one. You won't get there. The point is to get started and keep refining it. I've made the point before about all time really has to be logged. If it's not, I saw someone do a presentation at a CIO Perspectives conference, and he said, imagine going out to the driving range, and I'm a golfer, so it appealed to me, and it's night, and the lights are off, and you hit the golf ball. And you go, oh, that felt good. I think I did it pretty well. So I'll assume I hit a good shot. You don't know if it faded, pulled, went high, went low, went short. You have no idea. So you hit another one and go, oh, that felt good. And now you're practicing something that's actually becoming permanent that may actually be a disaster and you don't know it. That feedback is so critical. Some people ask, if we're just getting into resource management and have never done this before, where do we start? Start with the time logging. We did this at CNS Wholesalers, a Daptiv customer that is actually a very large wholesaler of groceries. They started on the time tracking path, took a few months to go down the, let's talk about the resource management analysis now. And by the way, they got some great adoption on the time tracking path pretty quick. So that tends to work. I mean, if you start with the time tracking, you have data now to analyze to feed your planning. If you don't have that utilization analysis, your first plans are kind of shooting in the dark until you get some of that analysis in. So just very critical again to understand the actual log time. A few lessons we've learned as we've implemented resource management at hundreds of customers now. The first one, as I've already mentioned, time logs are our best asset, our best ally. We've had incidents where, and actually I've done this one, where a project manager comes up and says, this is going to be a 500-hour project. I've done my bottom-up planning, I've put my schedule together, and it all adds up to 500 hours. And I'll look at it and go, we've done 10 of these projects before, and they averaged 300 hours. So make it 300 hours. No, I've done my bottom-up analysis, it's 500. See, it's like, then your bottom-up analysis isn't right because we've done it the last 10 times for 300 hours. So you might want to go look at those past projects and figure out how it was really done. And I've seen it the other way. They estimate 500 and it really should be 1,000. You know, you can actually take the time logs and figure out how long these things take, and that's actually better feedback than the bottom-up plans that you might see. Start simple. This is actually not just true for the capacity planning I talked about, but for time logging. If you give someone a timesheet with 100 time buckets to log, I've got 10 projects with a bunch of tasks each, and I've got 50 buckets of non-project time broken down to, you know, not just this administrative, but was on a meeting, what kind of meeting, was it a general meeting, a staff meeting, was it training, what kind of training, it was, you know, programming training, it was process training, it was HR training. I have seen customers, I won't name them of course, that have, you know, 200 buckets for logging time because they think they need to analyze it. And what's the result? People aren't logging their time. Or they're putting it all in one miscellaneous bucket because they don't know how to break it out. So start with some simple buckets and break it down further if you need to, as you find you need more detail, but don't start with too much detail and group it up as you find you don't need it. Start larger and break it down as you do need it. Real key that we all know from project work, you know, having good executive sponsor, good communication is critical, really critical for implementing this resource management stuff. That CIO at CNS Wholesalers logged his time. We've had several CIOs log their time and other executives as well. Yeah, it's all going 888 into management, but it sets the example. Also, them having them looking at the time analysis reports leads to adoption. Nothing hurts adoption more than having people logging time and thinking it's going into a black hole and it's not being used. It needs to be communicated, how it's being used, what decisions are being made with the data so that they know that it's being put to good use. We've often been asked, what's the best way to pilot resource management? Oh, well, let's do these 3 big projects. If you think about what I just talked about, where you have to account for non-project work, you have to account for capacity, Projects doesn't cut it there. You're only getting 35% of the time. You're not piloting how does the whole stack look. We like to pilot across a department. So if it's in IT, maybe we pilot the development area and the PMO, something like that, so that we see a mini time slice that is comprehensive rather than just trying to look at it as projects. That then gives us the feedback to tell us, A, are we getting adoption? B, is our analysis right? Things like that. And as I mentioned before, resource planning is refined over time. Over several cycles, your guesses will get better and better, and you'll adjust. A piece of this is making sure you're willing and ready to adjust. Having that time logged helps you adjust, but it is something that's refined over time. It's not something that's perfect right from the start, but it sure is better than throwing darts at the wall and hoping you get it right. So that's the basic presentation I have today, and I think we will open it up for questions.